Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second session in the second series of American English Live Teacher Development. My name is moderator Kate, and I'll be with you behind the scenes today, along with my colleagues moderator Lauren and Heather. Today, our host John Mark will be talking with English language specialist Emily Titchich about how routines can support classroom management and teacher planning in the English as a foreign language classroom. So let's go ahead and get started by welcoming our host, John Mark King. Welcome.
Hi, Kate, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Well, as you can see, I'm doing extremely well. I'm super excited about today's session. How about you?
Yes, definitely. I'm very excited as well.
All right, well, shall we get started?
Let's go for it.
All right, going for it right now. Everybody, welcome to American English Live Teacher Development Series 2. We are super glad to see you here today and continue our second series of these events with a great presentation by Emily Titchich. We'd like to extend a warm welcome, first of all, to our first-time viewers. And of course, as always, we're very happy to see those of you who attended our last series here again for series number 2. It is wonderful to be with you all today. My name is John Mark King. If you didn't know, I work in Washington, D.C. at the Office of English Language Programs, and I'm also part of the American English social media team. I'm extremely excited to be a facilitator and your host for today's session. I want you to look at this photo of an American English Live viewing group at the Baku American Center. The viewing group met with the Cultural Affairs Officer and the Outreach Program Coordinator from the U.S. Embassy in Baku to discuss their impressions of American English Live Series 1, along with new techniques they were planning to use in their own classrooms prior to being presented with their Series 1 certificates that you see here in an awards ceremony. Isn't that fantastic? Congratulations to the Baku American Center viewing group. We're very, very happy for you. So as you can see, we absolutely love it when teachers show us learning and sharing ideas as they view the American English Live series. So please share your viewing group photos by emailing them to americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org or by sharing them on social media. But if you do, make sure you tag us at American English for Educators so that we can see the great photos you post. We may even feature one of your photos in our next session, which is really incredible if you think about it. All right, let's take a look at the exciting lineup we have for this series over the next 6 sessions. Our presentations for this series are on the topics of classroom management, using authentic materials, and teaching with technology. We're excited for all we're going to learn. I want to know what you're most excited to learn about. So please share it in the comment section below right now. But here's a little bit about what you can expect. Each of our sessions is about 60 minutes long and is based on a Teacher's Corner theme on the American English website. This month, we're discussing classroom management, and you can see some links that the moderators are sharing with you right now in the comment section related to that theme. We hope you find those resources useful. The presenter will present the material, and I, as your host, will ask questions and make some comments too. But we really hope, most of all, to hear from you, our audience, so that we can make sure to address your thoughts, your challenges, and your ideas related to the topic. So please write your comments and questions below the video as we speak, and make sure to include your name and your country so that we can mention you when we share your ideas live. One English teacher and 850 students? No problem. Head over to our English Teaching Forum webpage, americanenglish.state.gov/forum, to view this special online-only edition of My Classroom Mexico, to see how Fabiola Cruz Arellano makes it work. I know, 850 students. I'm not sure I believe it. I wouldn't if I hadn't seen it. You should see it too. And as you may know, today you'll have an opportunity to receive a digital badge from our team here at American English for Educators, always on the cutting edge of technology. At the end of the session, you'll be given a link to complete a short quiz to receive your digital badge, which those of you who know us well know that it's kind of like an electronic certificate. In order to get this special, incredibly advanced technologically digital badge, you have to answer 2 out of 3 multiple choice questions correctly and also respond to a short answer question. Be careful though. You can only enter your information one time. So take your time, make sure that you read each question very, very carefully. Once you have completed it, by the magic of the internet, you will receive your badge by email in about 1 week. And now, for today's session, how routines support effective classroom management and teacher planning. Today's event will explore simple techniques that you can implement as everyday routines that maximize student agency, learning, and participation, while also increasing overall teaching efficacy. You will review classroom management best practices, identify how routines can support positive classroom management, as well as maximize lesson planning time. And you'll learn practical strategies for establishing routines. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Emily Tichich. Emily began her teaching career in Ecuador and has since gone on to teach and train English language high school and university teachers in the Republic of Georgia, Japan, South Korea, and in the US at the University of Minnesota. She has an MA in English as a second language from the University of Minnesota, and her teaching interests include technology in the classroom and curriculum design. So finally, Emily, welcome. How are you today?
Great. I'm really happy to be here. So it's nice to see you again.
Yes, well, I'm super excited about today's presentation. I think that both I and our participants will come away after about an hour with some, what I like to call Monday morning activities. In other words, something that they can do right away in the classroom.
Yeah, I hope so. So welcome everybody. Welcome to AE Live. I'm happy to be here today to talk with you about this topic. I just like to say that this topic comes from my own experience. When I was a first year teacher in New York City, I struggled. I struggled with lesson planning. I struggled with classroom management. And I found out of desperation, I sort of found these routines and they really, really helped me. So I'm hoping what I did was I started implementing something called a do now in my classroom. And it gave me this amazing 2-for-1. Yeah, I was able to predict what I was going to do every day. And I was also able to improve my classroom management. It was unpredictable that would happen just because of one simple routine, but that's what happened. So this presentation comes really from my heart, from my own experience. I'm happy to be here.
Sounds great.
Yeah, so I look forward to it. Can I do a shout out for my teachers in Georgia?
Please.
I was a fellow there a few years ago, and I also have a very soft place in my heart for my Georgian teachers. So thank you, Georgian teachers, for participating today. If we can look at the next slide, I can give you an overview of what we'll be doing today. So we'll look at goals, of course, the goals of the session. I will talk to you a little bit about how effective routine and effective classroom management are connected. And I hope that's one of your takeaways today. We will also look at keys to an effective routine, some advice for making a routine activity work. I do have some routine activity ideas for you. I hope they're useful. They may be things you're doing already. We will do some problem solving as well. This is before the Q&A if we have time at the end. So that's an overview of what we'll be doing today. On the next slide, you can see my do now for you. So this is an example of something I do with my students, and I thought this would be a great way to start today. My question for you, participants, all of those teachers out there, teacher trainers, is do you currently use routines in your classroom? And if so, what do you use?
I would love to hear this from our participants. While we're waiting for responses to come in, Emily, would you mind if I shared one from my experience? So when I was a teacher, I definitely used routines, although I wasn't as mindful about the value that they have as routines at the time. But thinking back, for sure, when I would teach, for example, an academic reading class, we had an everyday activity where they were required to read what was called their summary response journal from the night's reading aloud to a classmate. And I did it every single day.
That's great. And so was it something students were able to do without your help?
Well, at first, of course, I had to give them the instructions, what is the assignment? Why are we doing it?
Of course.
Why it's important. Of course, they always wanted to know what their grade would be if it counted, towards their final grade.
Right.
But after that, no, I would just say when I walked in, okay, guys, it's time to share your summary response. And they would snap right to it.
That sounds like an ideal.
Let's see, but we're getting some from our audience. Let's see. Angela Ramai says routines working on Valerie using an app called Charades.
Cool.
Monica Flores Rojas starts class with the agenda for the day, so students know what to expect. I like that a lot.
Me too.
Let's see. Rogerio Ruiz says, no, not so far, but he hopes to learn how to do so. I think we'll be able to help him today.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope everybody can leave with some new inspiration or some reinforcement for what you're already doing.
Agreed. Luis likes to play an English song at the end of class.
Oh, what a great
That's
idea.
really great. Let's see. And Maiko, who's from Georgia, uses some kind of like an energizer activity for her first grade class at the beginning of each
Sure.
lesson.
You're probably getting them focused, maybe out of their seats or into their seats, depending on what your purpose is.
Yeah, yeah.
That's great. And this is a reminder to me too of how useful your colleagues can be. And we'll talk about this throughout the presentation, but just, I'm presenting with you today, John Mark and I, but really your best resource is your colleagues, so just encouraging you to talk with your colleagues to see what they're doing. Great. Let's look at the goals of the presentation today. So there are three. Today you'll learn the advantages of incorporating routines into your classroom. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the key points of making a routine work. So some of the things to remember if you're trying to establish a routine in your classroom. And also there are several practical examples of routine activities to help develop a positive classroom environment through effective classroom management. I mentioned that at the beginning, that's really 2 for 1, as we say, that through a routine, not only can you develop this very positive tone in your classroom, but then that deters classroom management issues, we hope. But if we look at the next slide, we can see how complex classroom management is. So all of these different colored bubbles represent the complex variables that are included in classroom management. And I included this slide because there in the middle, you can see this word consistency. And I love this slide because it really drives home the fact that that consistency is key for classroom management. Despite
I like this a lot. Well,
Yeah.
How I understand this, and you can help me if I'm correct or not. When we talk about classroom management, we're not just talking about making sure that the students are behaving themselves, right? Or it's not necessarily organizational. It's managing the classroom so that the most effective learning happens, at least the way that we plan for it to happen. Am I right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think classroom management, in order for classroom management to be successful, I think the teacher really needs to feel very confident with what they're doing in the classroom. If you're a new teacher or if you're new to a certain teaching situation where you are now, you know that you can be very unsure of how things are going to go. So this consistency is just a reminder, and we'll talk about how to do this through routines. It's just a reminder that you do have some control over how, what happens in your classroom every day. There are many things you don't have control over. And of course, we know how complex the variables are in classroom management. All of the issues students bring to class, but there are some things that you as a teacher can implement. So how are routines connected to this idea? If we move to the next slide, this is something I hope teachers, those of you participating, I hope you can take away today. That's why there's this big red star. Effective routines equal effective classroom management. Is this all there is to classroom management? No, of course not. But routines can be a huge benefit for you in classroom management. So let's take a look at what a routine is.
I was just going to ask, Emily, what is a routine?
Well, I think the participants who are listening right now and watching, you probably have lots of different ideas of how you would define what a routine means to you. And it's true. There are many, many ideas of what a routine is. One of the things, if we can show the definition here, this is a very simple explanation. A routine is any daily activity. It's not anything special. It's any daily activity that students can complete with little or no help from you, the teacher. So that's how I'd like us to frame the idea of a routine today. I would like us to broaden the idea of what a routine is or what it can be, and also acknowledge some misconceptions about routines. The first one being that many people think routines are just for children. Excuse me, because I think if you're working with young children, no matter what you're teaching, if you're working with young children, we think there's a lot of things they need to be taught, how to be a successful student, how to be a member of a community. And that is definitely, routines can play a part in that. But I think from my own experience and maybe from our participants as well, routines are certainly not just for children. They're for younger children, for middle school, for upper level, for high school. Even adults benefit from routine. Many people benefit from that kind of predictability. There's
Yeah,
two other.
I totally agree. I mean, if we think about as adults, just our daily lives, there are things that we do every day at the same time of day that help us to get through our day, right? It only makes sense. And I really like that you emphasize here little or no help from the teacher, because
Yeah.
that's the goal, right? Where the goal of the teacher is to make him or herself obsolete to the student, right?
Well, I think that's one of the ways we would define successful learning. Can students do something independently from you? And a routine activity is a way, in my own experience and from what I've seen from my colleagues, it's a way for you to establish that opportunity for them to be successful. Two other misconceptions, if I can just mention those now, is that routines are evidence of a lazy teacher. And I think this is what I thought when I was a new teacher in my New York high school. I thought if I wasn't doing something new every day and exciting and the latest activity, then I wasn't doing enough. And so this is something that we'll talk about throughout the presentation as well. It is certainly not the case, nor, this is the last misconception, nor are routines evidence of a boring classroom or a boring teacher. I think any teacher who's establishing something with a clear purpose, clear directions, and trying to make it relevant to students, it doesn't matter if you're doing the same thing every day. Students will learn if they feel motivated to do that.
I like it. Emily, we have a quick question from Rizwana Islam. I like this question a lot. I want to share it. She's asking, why no help from the teacher? To form a habit, students need scaffolding, don't they?
Yeah,
Can you
absolutely.
please elaborate, she asks.
Sure, and that's actually something we'll talk about as well. When I say that there's little or no help from the teacher, that's your end goal. That's not where you start. So anytime you're establishing any activity, as you can imagine from your own class, you are establishing expectations. Maybe you're modeling, you're giving students a sense of purpose. Why are they doing this activity? And then, of course, you're giving them a chance to ask questions about it. As we talk later about the specific kinds of routines, I'll share with you too, they can take a while to establish, and they take more time. They might take more time than you expect. But again, this routine the definition here is an end goal. It's not something students will be able to do on day one. And it doesn't say no help. It says little or no help. So that's up to you to decide how much help students need from you. Thank you for the question. That was great. So what does a routine look like? Well, it looks like a lot of things, and we can zip through these pictures. I think in general, for example, this one is showing that students are doing something, maybe reviewing for a test or doing a book discussion. Maybe they're discussing a chapter that they read or previewing something, who knows? In a language classroom, though, this is a very common activity. Here, we have no idea where the teacher is. And that's why I love this picture so much, because we say, oh, well, here's some students and it looks like they know what to do. This is probably not the first time they've done something like this.
So you're going to show us a few pictures here, right?
Yep.
And I think I would like for our participants to let us know what they see happening.
Yeah,
these are pictures of students engaged in routine activities, right?
That would be great.
I mean, I can say right off from the beginning in this first picture that I see students sitting in a circle. I don't see a teacher nearby. I see them relying on each other.
Yep, this can be an example of a collaborative routine, something where students are not necessarily working independently, but they are, depending on each other. And that too can improve classroom management because students can begin to forge relationships with each other. Yep, maybe they're reading a play. Good, thank you for the comments. I can see them here too. In this picture, we can see that the teacher this is probably the teacher standing in the middle of the classroom. I love this picture because the boys are so on task. And this might look like your classroom or what you would like your classroom to look like. But we can see that the teacher is in a more observational role. Mm-hmm. So this is an example of that little help. The teachers are there. If the boys or girls need anything, the teacher's available. But the students are very clear on what it is they need to do.
Mm-hmm. Nasreen Anjuman Rooney says, and this will come up later, I believe, I'm just highlighting it now, routine benefits the teacher as well as the learner, doesn't it?
Yes, and thank you for commenting that. If you can hold that comment or that question, you have previewed what we're going to talk about next. So that's
now this third picture, they all look different to me. It's all different activities.
Yeah, I love this one. This is kind of the point. A routine is not one specific activity, although there are lots of things that teachers use as routines. this classroom is probably noisy and there's a lot of activity. But if we look at it again, we're not sure where the teacher is. Maybe they're in the back in the blue shirt. We're not sure. But the students are doing something collaborative and they're on task. That's what I see when I look at this. And I think this is probably not the first day that students have done something like it may be, but it might not be. It might be a regular. Give what to do. In the next picture, we can see, oops. In this next picture, we can see there are 3 boys on the floor. I love this one too. This is probably a reflection of what many of our participants' classrooms may look like if you're teaching younger children and do a lot of reading. Again, they're on the floor or on low seats and look at them. They're so intent on what they're doing. It's clear to me that the teacher has very clearly told them what the expectations are. And it might just be read for 15 minutes. Maybe that was the expectation, but the boys know what to do. It's probably not their first day doing this either.
Yeah, so Monica Flores Rojas just said the same thing that you said, that the students know what to do. And I think that's something that's evident in all of these pictures. None of the students looks confused or not sure what's going on. They're doing different things, but they all seem to be well aware of what their responsibilities are, even when there's not a teacher around.
Yeah, and so they're on task and their teacher is nowhere to be seen. Of course, we know that the teacher's in the classroom somewhere, but the boys don't need the teacher at this moment. So this goes back to the previous comment about, how could you possibly give no help to your students? The teacher's available, of course, that's what we do, but the students know what to do. So my next question for our participants is, and this came up already, how do routines benefit students and teachers?
That's a great question. Do we want to see if our participants have answers?
I would love it.
Let's focus on perhaps the teacher, because I recall in my experience when I had a routine, it definitely made it easier. If I had a routine at the beginning of a lesson, for example, it made it easier to start the lesson, because sometimes, I don't know, maybe I arrive right when the lesson starts. I couldn't get there early, right?
Yeah,
but my students know what's required. I walk in and I say, okay, guys, response journal time. Without any instructions, they get right to work. That was definitely a big benefit to me.
Yeah, that's a great description. And I hope that that's a reality for some of our participants. Probably it is. So participants, in what ways, John Mark just mentioned that teachers can benefit because you aren't necessarily planning at the last minute. You have a set predictable activity to start on Mondays or on Tuesdays or whatever day you decide. So again, when you tell students it's time to do this, they know what to do.
Well, Ya Riza says that routines create a comfortable atmosphere, right? Which of course the teacher establishes, so that benefits the teacher. And when a student is comfortable, maybe they're more likely to experiment with language, take risks with language, right?
Good point. Yeah, so we know that students can learn better in a predictable environment. And with language too, there's so much ego involved in risk taking that if you can make your environment more comfortable, yes, students may likely be more successful. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at 3 ways that routines can benefit students. And I think all of these are fairly straightforward. So participants, maybe you've thought about this already. The first way is that routines can develop a more predictable environment, reducing stress. And we've touched on that already. The next way is that routines can promote independent learning, which basically means that if you're doing, like I mentioned before, if you're doing something again and again, students are able to eventually do it by themselves without your help. The next one is that routines can provide practice through repetition, which can lead to mastery. I really like this idea because the benefit is that students have the ability to get better at doing something. So instead of telling them, like I thought as a new teacher, I thought, oh, I should introduce a new activity every day. That's what good teachers do. And then I realized that's not necessarily what good teachers do. Good teachers give students a chance to get better. You're showing them that they're competent.
Yeah, Sarah from Guatemala says that routines benefit teachers. This reminded me of it because the students become more independent and they're likely to lead more in class. I like that idea a lot.
Yeah, great point. So that's probably something you can visualize in your classroom. And that's true too. You might get better participation, including students leading more often. So let's switch lanes for a minute. This is not an exhaustive list, but let's switch lanes for a minute and think about how routines can benefit you, their teachers. I think I've touched on some of these ideas already, but there are three things that I came up with based on my experience and my colleagues' experience. I've mentioned this already. Students require less direction. Wouldn't that be amazing? So instead of you standing up in front giving directions all the time, you simply say, like your example earlier, you simply say, it's time for X, and they know what to do and how to do it.
Yeah, isn't that the essence of the student-centered learning environment?
Yes, it is. Good point. The next idea is that routines can contribute to smoother transitions at the start and end of class. So instead of students, walking through your door and finding their best friend or, making some noise, they might see something on the board that says, do this now. And so that would be a routine where, so instead of walking in and wondering what you're doing, they walk in and immediately know what they're doing. So that's a smoother transition. And at the end of class too, it's less, I think it's less common. We don't think of our class endings the same way we think of the beginnings, but I think it's important to consider, how do students feel when they leave your classroom? And is there a routine activity that can somehow develop a tone that you want them to leave with?
Yeah, I like the idea of students knowing exactly what to expect when they walk in. I mean, because language learning is difficult, it's challenging, can be sometimes terrifying, right? But knowing right away, okay, I know what's happening first thing in class. I think that's a wonderful way to start.
Yeah, and I think it can make students feel more secure and it can be more predictable as well. So the next one, this is one of my favorites, is that establishing a routine can save time in class. So you're giving less directions, you're spending less time establishing something, but also out of class. This is really important. And I hope this is a takeaway for your teachers, for you participants. I really want to convince you that by having a routine, you don't have to do as much lesson planning. And so if you're like me, like I was, and like I still am, you're constantly thinking about what am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to do tomorrow in my class? But by establishing a routine, you can reduce that cognitive load. And then you can spend that time doing other things for your class that you need to do. So I hope those make sense.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And it reminds me of something that I was told when I was a graduate student in my own MA TESOL program. And a professor told me that the great teacher works really hard before the class, right? And doesn't work very hard during the class. That's when the students are supposed to work hard, right?
Yeah.
But what you're saying is, okay, yeah, work hard, get ready for your lesson, but here are some ideas that might reduce that workload a bit for you because we're all very busy.
We're all very busy and there's no end. There's no end to our tasks,
right.
like our students. And so in this way, we can begin to minimize the effort that we're putting into how am I going to start class or how am I going to give directions for this? So, and I'm encouraging teachers, and I'll talk about this in just a minute. I'm definitely encouraging teachers to keep it simple.
Right. And well, regarding that, and maybe we can just hold on to this and come back to it, but it's important to note, Sun Vu wants to know, how do we form routines without making things feel monotonous?
Oh, that's such a good question. And yeah, thank you for the question, Sung Vu. We will talk about this while we're talking about the different activities and also the problem solving that we'll do at the end. So hold on to that question. And if you need it, if we don't answer it, ask it again and I'll make sure that I address it later. So I do have here we are again with our big red star. I've mentioned some concepts already about routines and why they're beneficial, but in the next part, I'll try to make it a little bit more concrete. So with advice for how to use routines effectively. So yep, you can go to the next slide. So some advice that I have, and this is again based on my own experience and on the experience that I've seen from the teachers that I've trained. The first one is to keep it simple. And yes, it's a problem. We don't want it to be boring or monotonous, but simple doesn't mean boring. Simple means simple. It means that you're not spending lots and lots of time creating, or your students aren't spending lots and lots of time trying to learn how to do something. Instead, you're keeping it simple with the learning goal in mind. And I just want to remind you, the lesson I learned when I was a new teacher is that harder work doesn't necessarily mean a better lesson. That's a tough.
You know what it means. For example, you can have the same activity as part of a routine, but that doesn't mean the content has to be the same every time.
Absolutely. Right? Yep. And we'll look at some examples of that later. Thank you. The next piece of advice that I have is to explain your expectations. And I think this is a no-brainer for teachers. Of course, we know we're always giving directions to our students, but in a routine, especially if you want it to work, So if you want to include a new routine activity and you want to use it throughout a semester or throughout a year, then you have to, at the beginning, you have to explain what is it exactly you want students to do. If you're doing, your earlier example was a reading response, summary response.
That's right.
Yeah, so I'm sure that you told students why you're doing it, how many minutes they had to talk about it, what the expectation was, if you were going to talk about it afterwards, what the check was that you were going to give them, and was it going to be anonymous? Should they be critical? Lots and lots of details to give them about to make that activity successful. So I would just tell teachers at the beginning, yes, plan to spend a little bit more time explaining your expectations. It'll be worth it. The last one is to reinforce student efforts. And this has to do with language. Again, we've mentioned that language learners bring a lot of risk and ego into the classroom. They don't like to not know how to do something. It can be very, make them feel like they aren't being successful. So as teachers, especially if we're giving them a chance through a routine, if we're giving them a chance to learn how to do something, as we see the progress that they're making with that activity. So if it's a reading activity, a writing activity, whatever it is, a discussion activity, whatever that routine is, we're always looking for ways to reinforce their efforts in a very positive way. So if I can move to the next slide, I have some examples of language and just a reminder of how powerful teacher language can be in a classroom. So one situation that you might encounter is during a routine activity, a student seems distracted and is not completing the assigned task. We can imagine that. Teachers can respond in numerous ways, get back to work or whatever. One response could be, do you remember what you've been assigned to do? That's an innocent question. We say things like this all the time. The other response, though, is a reminder of how this routine activity can reinforce student behavior. So teacher 2 says, you're familiar with this routine. Do you need me to help you get started? So it's a message to the student that I expect you to be able to do this. And little by little, you're going to be able to do this without my help.
So it reinforces that student independence. That's so key to making routine successful.
Yeah, and I would say too that something like this is beneficial, equally beneficial for a young student, a university student, or an adult. So this is not age specific. And you as a teacher decide how you would word that. But it's a reminder to say, hey, students, you know what to do. If you need help, I'm here, but you know what to do. If we look at the next one too, there's another example. This happens to me all the time. So I walk into class and I'm ready to start my routine activity, and many students have their phones out, distracting them from the activity. This is probably a very common if your students have phones. One response, which a lot of my colleagues use, is put your phones away. It's time to start the activity. Okay, that's innocent. That makes sense. But again, there's an opportunity here to say something like, oh, remember. So this is response 2. Remember, you don't need your phones for this activity. So again, showing students, you know what to do. I expect you to do it. And, show me you know how to do it. We can move to the next slide. Here it is again. Effective routines equal effective classroom management. And at this point in the presentation, we're going to talk about ideas in just a minute. But at this point, I just want to remind you that if your classroom is consistent, if it is clear, and if it is supportive, students feel more secure and motivated to participate and ultimately be successful. So I hope participants, I hope you're starting to visualize what your classroom looks like and what you would like it to look like.
Well, and speaking of that, Miriam Montoya says that reinforcing students' effort is great. They will feel, as a result, important and empowered.
Well, those are 2 important words. Students would like to feel like they matter, like you as a teacher are not there just to tell them what to do. And that's, it's harder in some classrooms than others, especially if you are dealing with large classrooms. I know this is very, very challenging. However, it is possible, and there's always opportunities, even if it's just with one student or a couple of students, there are always opportunities to make them feel like you believe they can do it. Let's move on. This is kind of the exciting part. So teachers, I hope so far it's been useful, but I think it will continue to be a little bit more useful because we've looked at the why and the how of routines, but now I'd like to share with you some examples that I've used and I've also seen my colleagues use, and I've also used with teachers that I've worked with. So I've categorized them into the beginning of class and the end of class. As we look at these, make sure that you're thinking about your current teaching situation and what you think would work for you. They can always be adapted.
I like that a lot because routines You can't just do the same routine with all of your students all the time.
No,
Your students have different needs. They have different learning goals, right?
that's right.
Different ages, different levels. So yeah, think about your classroom and how this might apply with your specific students.
Yeah, or how you might adapt it. And that, that's if that comes up later, if we have time, we can ask teachers, how might you adapt some of these activities? So this is not an exhaustive list, but I hope some of them are useful for you. So some instructional routine ideas here. At the beginning of class, I usually do something called a do now. And this is what I did with you all at the beginning of this session today. What is it that I wanted you to think about? And I asked you to do that and gave you a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds to think about it. So I have 3 do now activities that I can share with you. The first one, I just call it focus, which means when students walk into your room, what exactly is it you want them to do? Whatever it is, you don't have to say it. You don't have to say today, you can simply, as a teacher, you can write it on the board. And as students, become more familiar with this routine, they know when they walk into your room, they know to look at the board. I've trained my students to do this up to a point where when they walk in, I can just point. I'm standing at the board and I'm just like, hey, good morning, and I'm just kind of pointing up there. And I love it because it's not me that they hear as soon as they walk in. It's their own minds. Oh, this is what we're doing today. Okay. And of course I'm there. You can answer questions, especially if it's the first few times you do this. You can help them get started. But the expectation is, and you need to tell them this clearly, the expectation is that within a minute or two of arriving in your class, they're doing whatever it is that you've asked them to do.
That's great. And it's like we think about another kind of a classroom activity that we're all familiar with, say group work, for example. Well, we know that the first 2, 3, maybe 4 times we try group work in the class, it doesn't always go as we expect, but eventually it does. And we can take that same approach to a classroom routine.
That's
We can try it out, keep trying it. Eventually students will catch on. It will benefit everybody.
That's what I've seen in my experience. And that's why this topic interests me so much, because I'm convinced that if you pick an activity that you actually think is effective, has a real significant learning purpose in your class, then students will catch on to that. And if you keep your expectations consistent, clear, and supportive, they will respond to that. On the next slide, I have some examples of what a do now might look like. So this
and I would also, while we're doing this, I would love it if while Emily's sharing her examples, please share your own examples in the chat box if you have some.
That would be great. Yeah, I'd love to know what our participants are currently doing or how they're doing it. I don't need to read all of these, but these are just examples of some things that I've used. One of the things to notice is that this do now, I know we're all language teachers, but this kind of do now is not only for language teaching. It certainly can be, but you could do this with anything that students are learning. It's simply when you walk in, this is what I want you to do right now. And it's more than just take out your homework. It's, find your resource and do something with it. Something that would take at least a few minutes for students. The next one is somewhat similar, but a little bit different. It's something I call the quote of the day. And I have used this do now, probably 1,000 times with my university and my high school and my middle school students. And I've just adapted it depending on my audience and depending on the class. This is simply, again, when students walk into the classroom, they look at the board, they know to do that. You've told them to expect to do that. And there's something written on the board and it's a quote. It could be a poem. It could be a song lyric. It could be whatever it is that you want them to think about. And as you're greeting them and answering any questions they have, they're reading the quote and any questions you have to go along with it. This is considered a type of writing activity or a journal activity. It could also be done orally, depending on the purposes of your class. If you're teaching, or if you're working with speaking skills with students, any age students, this is something you could also use. If we move
we have a couple of examples.
Oh, great.
Let's see. Mayu Coelho with 3rd graders starts writing today's activities on the board. And now every time she forgets to write it, they remind her about it and ask, what will we do today? Yeah. I love it. Maiko also makes a board of irregular verbs. And when the students come in, they read the new ones that have been written down.
Oh, what a great routine. Great. Thank you for sharing those. And again, a reminder, always ask your colleagues what they're doing because, teachers have ideas. So sharing those ideas is really important. This is an example of a quote of the day that I've used. Maybe some of you participants have used something like this as well. Notice the quote I chose, be the change you wish to see in the world, by Gandhi. It's inspiring. It sets a tone. So this is a reminder too, that in terms of classroom management, the words are powerful. So depending on what you're asking students to do, you are also affecting the way that they feel when they walk into your classroom. I have 4 questions here. You don't have to use 4. You could use 1, you could use 2, you could have, there's any number of questions you could use. These are just some that I've used. So after 20 years of teaching, this is my big secret, which is my Do Now weekly schedule. I love my job, but it's taxing. We know that as teachers, we're constantly overloaded with details, things to think about. So this is what I've done. And I've done this with my university, my high school, and my middle school students in all of my language classes. This is what has evolved in terms of my own routine. You can see that on Monday and Wednesday, they do the same thing. Tuesday is something different. Thursday is different. Friday is different. So back to the question about, how do you avoid making routines monotonous or boring? I think part of the answer is yes, variation. Students love variation. Within that variation, there is an element of predictability.
Mm-hmm.
So if they love writing, then maybe Mondays and Wednesdays, they're so excited to come to class. If they struggle with vocabulary, Fridays can be challenging, but it's a way for me to show them all of these are important, all of these skills, the reading, the writing, the vocabulary, and it's important that we take time every week to work on them. And I love it too, because then I don't have to think, what am I going to do tomorrow?
Well, what do you think? I mean, is maybe the answer to how a routine becomes not boring and not monotonous lies in whether the students just feel like it's relevant to them, right? If I don't think it's important, if I don't see how it addresses my goals, why I'm here, then it's going to be boring or monotonous. So it's not the activity itself, it's whether the activity appears to be designed specifically for my needs.
That's right. And so when I'm doing activities like this, and this is true of almost anything I do, I'm usually telling students, this is not for me. Like, we're not doing this quote of the day for me. I enjoy it. I like thinking about it, but it's for you to develop your writing fluency or your critical thinking, or it's for you to develop, the habit of writing in general, or the ability to think about your own ideas and express those instead of always waiting for someone to tell you what they think.
Yeah. Well, also, we have an interesting quote or a question from Rizwana Islam. I think this is a common challenge. She says, as a teacher, I suffer from the need to teach as much as I can.
Yeah.
So how many routines should we have in a class?
Oh, there's no answer to that. I'm sorry. I wish I had a perfect answer. The answer is just, what do you need? It sounds like you're overloaded with probably a lot of content. Maybe you're working with a textbook and there's a lot of topics to cover. I suffer from the same issue. I shouldn't say suffer, but yes, I have to work with that as well. It's very challenging. You have to decide, you need to look at, and this is true for anybody, look at the time that you're using planning and maybe decide, is there a way for you to start implementing a similar activity every day? If there's a vocabulary unit in your textbook that you're always having to get to, maybe saying Mondays and Wednesdays, I always start with vocabulary. And that way you can stay on pace. And then you don't have to think, when am I going to do vocabulary? And that would be the same for if there's a writing or a reading or something else that's tied to your textbook. Timing is very challenging and there's no perfect answer.
That's fantastic. We're getting so many positive comments. I can't list them all. I want to thank everybody for them.
Yeah.
Emily, it looks like people are inspired to share their routines with each other, and also the ones that they do use to maybe use them more effectively in the classroom or more mindfully.
Yeah, I thank you for saying that, because I think one of the things that I'd like our participants to take away today is that you're probably already doing this in your classroom. Of course you have activities that you do more than once, and you're establishing expectations and giving directions, and you want students to become independent. What I would like you to do, though, is to take it one step farther and to begin to be more mindful, John Mark, as you just said, and to ask yourself, how can this benefit me? How can this benefit my students? And to really think about, can you take it a step farther, and create a tone in your classroom, maybe that you don't have already through these activities? Or can you rely on those routines that you have and try to free up some of the cognitive load that you feel because you have to teach so much? So that's I hope is the takeaway today. We can move on. So these are some activities. These are a little bit more simple. Probably some of you were doing these already. Maybe some of them are new. I just call these reflection activities because they're at the end of the class, but they can be at the middle, beginning, the end. They could be anywhere in the class. It depends on you and what you need. So the first one is a review, Mingle. Thank you. So this is a very simple concept, which is just give students a chance to talk about what they learned, what they want to learn, what they think they're going to learn the next day, whatever the questions are that are important to your community classroom. And these questions are on the board. They can be oral as well. But again, if it's a routine, you don't have to spend a lot of time establishing what to do every time you do this. Instead, you're telling students, okay, now is the time we're going to do our review mingle. And they know what that means. Yeah, if we move to the next slide, we can see some examples of questions, and maybe this will inspire some of our participants. I think all of these are a little bit different. It depends. The first one is related to content or skills. You know, what's one thing you learned today? A review mingle doesn't have to take very long. Maybe they talk to each other at their desks. Maybe they actually stand up if they can handle that, if they're mature enough, or if you give good enough directions and expectations. They stand up, they move around the classroom, and the expectation is they talk to 3 people. So again, modeling is very important in this one too. I like the next one. What is one thing you still have a question about? What do you remember about, you know, what verbs or whatever topic you talked about that day? And also, of course, what do you think we'll talk about tomorrow?
I like this a lot because this encourages them to build the very important skill of being able to interact with your own learning, right?
Yes,
to
absolutely.
think about what you've accomplished, what you want to accomplish, to make predictions about what might come next. These are all very, very valuable skills.
Yeah, and I think that's what I love about routines. It's not a secret. This is really best practices in teaching. Again, what I'm trying to remind teachers of is, you know, make it easier for yourself. You don't have to do something new every day. You can do something over and over, and it can still be useful and relevant and interesting for your students. They may even look forward to it.
Yes, well, Irma Ruth Mendoza Rosales agrees.
Great.
She says, I thought routines would be boring for the students, but from this perspective is a different view.
I hope so. Yeah, again, I'm glad to hear that. This is something that I've landed on in my own teaching, and it really makes my teaching more pleasant because I'm not spending time running circles in my head thinking, what am I going to do tomorrow? Instead, I'm thinking, you know what, Wednesdays, I'm going to do this. And I can incorporate whatever I need to for the learning goals into that routine activity as I need to. So there's two more ideas before we get to the problem solving. This is a very simple one. I think it's overlooked and undervalued. This is just simply giving appreciation. Students love to be heard, and students love to be appreciated. So this is a reminder to you that this can be a routine in your class. I've seen this done in high school. I've seen it in university. I've also seen it with children. And it's a chance to ask students, what's something you appreciated about this week or this day or this class? What's something that worked for you? So again, the teacher would establish this as a routine, which means that students have more than one opportunity to do this. You decide how often. And then again, students can share their appreciation orally, or they could do it in writing. It could be anonymous. It could be personal. You would decide. But the purpose again is about setting that tone in your classroom and giving students a chance to be heard. In the next slide, we can see some examples of some questions that you might use. I think the more specific the question, the better, but there's certainly endless types of questions you could ask. I love this one too. I've used this with my own students. I know some elementary teachers who use this strategy, and I also know at the university level too. I've used it with, like I said, I've used it with my students. It's just silence. Can you imagine?
You have to help me understand here. I thought that student talk time was good in life.
Yeah, student talk time is great. If your class is 60 minutes, let's have 58 minutes of student talk time, and let's have 2 minutes just to see what it feels like. So again, setting a tone and just reminding students, maybe this is at the beginning of class, which I've seen teachers do. I've also seen it at the end of class. you can imagine how silly students would get during, a silent time, and how they just want to start giggling or passing notes or doing something that they're not supposed to do. But it is an opportunity, again, to set a tone in your classroom and to show them that what your expectations are. So through modeling and through explanation, explaining to them in what way can this benefit them. I've written some ideas there at the bottom. These are pretty basic, but it's just a reminder. This time can be for anything. It can be a reflection. Think of something that was happy this week. It can be relaxation. Take a few deep breaths. It could be observation. Listen to the sounds around you. Notice something that you haven't noticed in the classroom before. Or it can be thinking and planning, like, you have a test tomorrow. I want 2 minutes of silence, and I want you to think about, are you ready for that test? So it can be anything. Another thing I should mention is start small. If you plan to do this routine activity, start with 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds, and plan for it not to go right the first time. Maybe not the second time, but after the third or fourth time, if students know that that's your expectation, they will do it, and they'll probably like it.
Oh, well, here is a question for our audience. I actually have a lot of answers already. Would you like me to share?
I'd love it. Yeah.
Well, let's see. Rizwana Islam uses a KWL chart.
Oh, yeah,
as
those are
a
great.
routine activity that students enjoy completing. Let's see. Maiko in Georgia reviews the activities that they went through in that lesson. Hassan Sharif really likes reflection time at the end of the lesson. Monica Flores Rojas loves breathing exercises at the end of the lesson.
Good for you.
Edison Santa Cruz, I like this one. Edison likes the students to look at a picture and the students share what thoughts it brings to mind.
Oh, I love it. And that's very similar to the quote of the day, but instead of this is a great adaptation. Instead of using
a photo of the day.
Yeah, a photo of the day, and you're asking students to do something. Thank you, everyone, for sharing these ideas. I see more popping up here on the chat. These are excellent, and it's a reminder. Talk to your colleagues. Ask them what they're doing and what they like. It's also a reminder that things can be very simple. If you're using any of these routine activities, continue to ask yourself, is there a way for you to step back? If you're still up there giving directions every time, is there a way for you to step back and have your students show you that they know what to do? This is just a reminder, depending on what routine you're choosing or want to choose or want to use, always consider your needs. I've given you some of my ideas. There's a million out there. Consider your students' needs. You know them best, and ask yourself, what is it that they would benefit from? The 3 keys we talked about: keeping it simple, explaining, and reinforcing. That's just best practices. I'm sure you know that. And the last one, of course, talk to your colleagues. So if we're ready to move on, we can do some problem solving, because if you're planning to use some of these routines or continue to use some that you've already used, I think it's important to look at, what might not work right the first time and how would we solve it. So if we can.
Let's do it.
How much time do we have?
We have between 5 and 10 minutes, so I think we're okay.
Great. Okay, then we'll have a chance to do at least a couple of these scenarios. This is one that was posted on Ning yesterday, and I did get some responses. The situation here is if you are working with the teacher who is a new teacher, and that new teacher is working very hard to do a good job, and you admire their energy and their new ideas. Great. That's great. We want that in a new teacher. But you notice that they're spending hours each day planning their lessons, and they're worried about finding new ideas to try. That was me in my first year. This is actually about me. What advice can you give them?
I would love to hear what our participants have to say to this teacher, what advice they would give, especially based on what we've learned already this hour. I can say I would love to maybe share my lesson plan with this teacher or invite this teacher into my classroom.
That sounds great. That teacher would appreciate that.
Let's see. Well, as we are waiting for more responses, why don't we move on to our next scenario?
I can mention a response that came up earlier.
Go ahead.
Which was that, very similar to what you just said, is a participant said, this teacher needs to hook up with a mentor colleague. So not just, observing, but then also following up and talking to them about, why do you do what you do and how do you do it?
Yeah.
So give them advice.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say, well, it's really incredible, all of this energy that you have. all these incredible new ideas that you have.
Right.
As an experienced teacher, perhaps I can offer you some advice that I received when I was a new teacher, and how perhaps routines can help me to save time and energy.
I work with a lot of student teachers in my program, and I'm amazed at how much they think that hard work equals better, like more work equals better. So some of the solutions is to remember that harder work doesn't necessarily mean a better lesson. And my impression with these student teachers is that they are working so hard to establish their credibility as teachers that they don't remember, they sort of forget that more is not always better.
Love it.
Yeah, so scenario 2, if we're ready. This is super common too. Good. A colleague, so trying and not succeeding. A colleague tries to implement a quote of the day writing activity, but is discouraged because students are complaining and they don't want to do it. Your colleague wants to give it up. What do you tell them?
I would wonder, how many times have you tried it?
Yeah.
What do you hope to accomplish in doing it? Is it just a time filler, or is it actually related to the learning goals of the lesson? I would say, just like we talked about before, don't give up, try it a few times.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think you said this too, but I would ask my colleague, why did you do this? Are you really interested in it? Or are you doing it just because you saw training and you thought you should do it? I think one of the take homes too is that if you as a teacher, if you don't like the activity, if you don't feel enthusiastic about it, your students will be able to tell, and they probably won't be as successful with it as you would like them to be. So I would not suggest trying something that you're really not interested in. So some solutions, I have a few solutions, there's more. Explaining the purpose of the activity to students is really important. That's how they know why are we doing this? Is it interesting? The quote of the day, is it something they actually want to write about? You could allow students to bring in questions. I've done that before. It's a little messy, but I'll tell you, they bring in things that I would never think of. So it's nice to see their ideas. Also, make sure that it's not too hard and not too easy. And of course, reinforce their efforts. I find that goes a long way in something like this, where you say, wow, I noticed that you wrote a paragraph today. That's great. And then a week later, I noticed you wrote a little bit more. Wow, good for you. Your fluency is really improving. So just finding a way to give them that, that reinforcement.
That's really great. And something that comes to mind that we haven't touched on yet, but I think is probably important, is that when it comes to choosing an activity with younger learners, I think that it's okay for the teacher to make the selection most of the time. But one thing about adults that we know is their learning tends to be more self-directed. So if a routine is not going well and it's with adults, I think teachers should feel comfortable saying, well, what kind of activity would you like to do? What helps you with your learning?
Sure. And actually, I just saw a participant, I think it was Jorge, someone just typed in, change the routine. And there's absolutely, it's your classroom. And if you've decided you gave it a shot, or maybe you tried the wrong thing, you really don't like it like you thought you did, change it. It makes it a little bit harder for you because then you're establishing 2 different routines, but it will be worth it. So I think it'll be worth that extra effort, especially if you're trying something for the first time.
Agreed. Well, I think, Emily, we have time for one more scenario, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, could we do number 4? This is similar. Waste of time. So this is scenario 4. This is common too. You've implemented a Mingle activity at the end of each class as a comprehension check. You're enthusiastic about it, but students are not having meaningful discussions with each other. Maybe they're just chatting about what they're going to do after school. It seems like a waste of class time. What can you do?
That's a great question.
There's a lot of things to think about, but there's some things that stand out to me here.
Well, for me, I would ask, well, what questions are you posing to them? Are they maybe too difficult? Are they related to the topic of the lesson? And do they understand why they're doing it? Do they understand what the value is?
That's right. Good. Good. So if we can look at the solutions, and participants, you probably have other solutions that popped into your head too. One is, you may not be giving students enough time. it's pretty common for students to be chatty. So give them 10, 15 seconds to get that out of their system, but then maybe say, now, now it's time. You've got 2 or 3 minutes. Now it's time to review. And the questions I want you to think about are these questions. You could, like John Mark, like you said, reconsider the questions, make sure that they're relevant to what students want, what you think they want to talk about or need to talk about. Explain the purpose. So again, telling them, this is not for me. I'm interested, I'm supporting you, but this is not for me. This review mingle is for you. It's a chance for you to check in with each other. It's a chance for you to be honest about something you didn't understand. It's a chance for you to be heard. And, and I'll give you a chance to talk about it as a group later, or whatever it is that works for you. And of course, be consistent. So that kind of is that key takeaway from today as well. So I think this concludes our session today. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have some new ideas for routine ideas, or some, I hope, newfound support from me and from your participants for routines that you're already doing. And I hope some of these ideas can transform your teaching, your classroom management, and especially your very precious, precious lesson planning time. So thanks again for your participation.
Super. Thanks so much, Emily. I want to say very quickly, a lot of our viewers, like, for example, Tina Sequieros, who said, I really changed my mind about routines in the class. They seem to be really excited to use routines more mindfully, as you said, and have completely changed their minds about what routines can accomplish. So well done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Well, I had a great time, everybody. I hope that you had a great